The U.S. and India are seeking to mend ties after a year of diplomatic seesaw. Tariffs imposed, then quickly scrapped because of the war in Iran. It's one example of how international relations and conflict have become more complex and interlinked in recent years. So is pragmatism replacing ideology in today's diplomatic world? This is Inside Story. Hey there, I'm Scott McLean. The U.S. top diplomat Marco Rubio is in India. A tricky trip, perhaps, after a year of turbulent relations because of trade tariffs and Washington's growing ties with Pakistan. The war in Iran has brought a U-turn by U.S. President Donald Trump, allowing India to buy Russian oil without penalty. It's just one example of how interlinked and complex international relations have become. While Russia's ally, Iran, has been at war with the U.S., Moscow's been wanting to avoid angering the United States, given its role in the Ukraine war. China has hosted the U.S. and Russian leaders in quick succession, and now Pakistan's too, 9 months after India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited. All normal diplomacy, some might say, but others may argue that in days gone by, international relations were clearer, defined more by ideology and established alliances. So are we witnessing a big change with pragmatism and global trade becoming the main driving force? We'll discuss this with our guest shortly, but first, this report by Alexandra Byers.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in India on what many are calling a repair mission. His first stop, the humanitarian organization founded by Mother Teresa. The 4-day visit also includes a meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and talks are expected to focus on trade, energy, and defense cooperation. Rubio is hoping to improve a relationship that's been hit by severe whiplash from the Trump administration for much of the last year. The U.S. has long tried to foster closer ties with India, seen as an important counterweight to growing Russian and Chinese influence. But those efforts suffered a setback last year when Trump slapped some of the highest U.S. tariffs on Indian goods, up to 50% at one point. Punishment, he said, for India buying Russian oil. It's a move that sent the Indian government scrambling. It committed to cutting out Russian oil, and Trump agreed to roll back some of those tariffs in an interim agreement. But India also pivoted, signing what it called the mother of all trade deals with the European Union. Just one example of the global ripple effect of the unpredictable nature of U.S. foreign policy. India has also been affected by the energy crisis sparked by the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, with no real option but to continue buying Russian oil. Washington's temporarily waived sanctions to help energy-vulnerable countries affected by its war. But it's also pressuring India to start buying American oil instead.
We want to sell them as much energy as they'll buy. And obviously, you've seen, I think we're at historic levels of U.S. production and U.S. export. We want to be able to do more. We were already in talks with them to do more. We want them to be a bigger part of their portfolio. We also think there's opportunities with Venezuelan oil.
It hasn't helped that Washington has grown closer to India's rival Pakistan, approving a $600 million sale of advanced upgrades for its F-16 jets and allowing Islamabad to emerge as a crucial negotiator with Iran. Rubio's India visit comes as Pakistan's prime minister is on a high-level visit to China, following closely on the heels of visits by President Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin. Just a snapshot of the complexity of international relations today, where conflicts and shifting alliances are changing the global system. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guests in New Delhi. Brahma Chellaney, a professor emeritus of strategic studies at the Center for Policy Research. In London, Chris Weafer, the chief executive officer at Macro Advisory Strategic Consultancy. And in Shanghai, Shaun, the founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for being here. Brahma, we'll start with you. Marco Rubio is in India right now to perhaps mend ties with the Indian government. But I wonder, if you're India, are you looking to put all of your eggs in the American basket, or are you looking to maybe hedge or de-risk and maybe forge stronger ties with some other global powers like Russia or China?
Trump has not only introduced greater volatility into the US-India relationship, but also damaged US credibility in Indian eyes. So certainly, India is not going to be putting all its eggs in the American basket. But geopolitically, Trump has also moved closer to both of India's two regional adversaries, China, as we saw from Trump's recent Beijing visit, and Pakistan. So for India, it's obvious that despite the warmth in the US-India relationship under successive American presidents until Trump returned to the White House, that relationship has to be seen by New Delhi as part of a wider basket of relationships, and therefore India is going to be far more realistic now in terms of its pursuit of the relationship with Washington.
Chris, does the U.S. have leverage over India? I mean, is there anything that Marco Rubio could do or say to get India maybe to say, pump the brakes on investment with Russia or Iran, where there is a trade corridor right now being established? Do they have something they can hold over India?
Well, it's more a case the U.S. is the world's biggest economy, and for any economy in the world to grow and to develop, India, of course, for sure, they need access or would like access to the world's biggest market. And the U.S. also, as we saw with the previous threats and imposition of tariffs, can make life very difficult for countries like India and others in terms of global trade. So if you like, the US has that stick in the sense that it is still the dominant economic power in the world. And, as we've seen in many countries, if you have a difficult relationship with Washington, with President Trump, with the US right now, then you have a difficult time in global trade. So that's really why it's holding over India and other countries.
Shaun, Rein, you're there in Shanghai. Is China also maybe de-risking from the United States? And why do you think that is?
Well, it's good to be here, Scott. I think what we've seen over the last 8 years is the United States and Europe has said that they want to decouple or de-risk from China. So what did China do? They listened, and they actually de-risked from the United States. So in 2017, when Trump started the trade war against China, a full 17% of China's exports went to the U.S. That number is down only to 11%. So exports from China to America only account for 2.5% of China's overall GDP. So China has de-risked from the U.S., but the U.S. hasn't de-risked from China, Scott. So, for instance, it's not just rare earths, where China controls 90% of refining. It's also in refining and smelting commodities like nickel, chrome ore, tungsten, copper, and it's also producing pharmaceuticals. So most pharmaceuticals go through China and India. About 90% of antibiotics are made in China, and about 100% of ibuprofen and paracetamol are made in China. So China has de-risked from the United States, which is why it has all the leverage over the US and Western Europe in trade right now, because those two markets, even though they said they wanted to decouple from China, really haven't built up their industrial base at all, Scott.
Shaun, does that perhaps explain why we are seeing less and less enthusiasm for this alliance called the Quad, made up of the US, Japan, Australia, and India? Meetings are becoming less common. Its power seems to be sort of exerted less often. Is that because everyone's getting comfortable with the fact that they all have a lot of eggs in the Chinese basket? And despite the fact that this alliance was formed to counter China's assertiveness, that they have to get along with China, whether they like it or not?
Yeah, part of it is because China's emerged as the largest trade partner for both India and Australia. So even just 3-4 years ago, India's largest trade partner was the United States at about 130 billion US a year. That number is up to 150 billion with China. But it also comes down to Trump. You have to think the United States for 70 years after the end of World War II really created a stable trading system for their allies and their partners. You know, they were terrible towards their enemies like Libya and Iraq. But if you adhered to the American rules-based system, you benefited. But Trump has really torn that apart, slapping 50% tariffs on India, trying to take Greenland from Denmark, questioning whether or not NATO should even exist. And at the end of the day, as we saw in the intro, Marco Rubio and before him, Tony Blinken, both were saying, we want Europe and India to buy American LNG and American oil. And so America is selling LNG to the Europeans at 4 times the price than what they were getting from the Russians before the Ukraine war. And now, India is facing energy shortages, so they're having to buy oil from the US. So at the end of the day, I think Quad is disintegrating because they can't trust America as that stable security guarantor that they had been for 70, 75 years after the end of World War II.
So we're interested in answering this question of, if it's not the rules-based order, what is the guiding light in today's foreign policy universe? So, Brahma, for instance, in India, Prime Minister Modi has not really pushed back very loudly against the Iran war, despite the obvious economic trouble that it's causing in his country. And I wonder, what does that tell us about India's foreign policy and what's guiding it right now?
India pursues an independent approach to international affairs, and it's been neutral in any conflict, whether it's the US invasion and occupation of Iraq or Russian invasion of Ukraine and now the Iran war. India has tried to pursue neutrality, but to answer your larger question, in the current landscape of global geopolitics, equations between major powers have become more transactional, reflecting how globalization is segmenting into distinct geopolitical spheres. International relations can no longer be viewed through the lens of a rules-based international order or multilateral treaties. We are seeing how international law and norms are being cast aside with the return of might makes right. We are also witnessing the rise of economic nationalism and protectionism, especially in the West. So, as a result, major power relations in the current era have become competitive. They are driven heavily by bilateral negotiation and economic nationalist priorities. Yeah. But I think one other important point that we should not overlook is that the global turbulence that we are seeing today is because the world is in transition from one era to another. The post-World War II international order is fading and a new order is emerging. But the new order's contours are still not clear. And as history attests, such transition periods bring great volatility and even conflict. So we are in a transition period, and transition means turbulence.
Chris, do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. We are absolutely in a very historic transition. As you say, the world has moved from kind of ideological differences. Life was so much easier and simpler to understand during the Cold War, for example. Sure. The US was dominant, if you like, in the world in terms of economics and finance. The Russians were much more ideological. They had they were not competing economically. They were not competing financially. It was all about ideology. That world has ended, as we know, and it has now been replaced with a world where the China has emerged and wants to be a kind of at least one of the two major powers, and it is transactional. It is, as Shaun pointed out, it's obviously it's the biggest trade partner for a lot of countries. It's growing bigger, and that's a new reality. And I think we saw this late last year when the US published its revised national security strategy document. I think that was a very clear kind of acceptance, certainly understanding, if not acceptance, of the fact that the world going forward is going to be dominated, or it's going to be competing between the United States and China. That is the reality, and I think the US has only accepted that in the last year or so.
You make your point, or what I hear you saying here is that, look, it's gone from a rules-based order to something more like transactionalism, I suppose you might say. But aren't there still examples, though, where this is not the case, where foreign policy from the West is still guided by values? I mean, Europe wanted to, in the wake of the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine, vowed to cut themselves off of Russian natural gas. And they have made huge strides in doing that. It used to be 40% of imports. Now it's down to 12%. I mean, aren't values still the guiding light for the West?
I think when you talk about Europe, I think that is absolutely the case. Ideology and values, and we hear that a lot. I do not think that is in any way the case in Washington or in the US anymore. I think the US has now gone full in terms of transactional. It is looking at the world in terms of its position relative to the emerging China. As I say, that document published in December made very clear that the US in future is going to be primarily focused on its own areas of interest, in its own areas of security, whether it's trade or militarily, etc. I think Europe has been left behind. Europe is going to have this kind of this inward discussion, as it were, or this reality check when perhaps the Ukraine war is over. Then you're going to have a world where Europe is like in the middle, geographically. Same with India, perhaps Saudi Arabia. You're going to have two very dominant countries which are very transactional based, that they want to control their spheres of influence. And Europe really is caught in the middle. They need to decide whether or not they're going to try and continue with an ideological-based approach, or will go transactional. And I think they'll have no choice but to adopt a transactional approach, given that China and the US clearly now are doing that.
So, Shaun, Chris says that the United States has gone full transactional when it comes to its foreign policy. But I would just push back on that by pointing out that there are still US sanctions on people and entities in Xinjiang over forced labor allegations and human rights abuse allegations. Isn't that still an example of the U.S. standing up for Western values?
Not really, Scott. So I view that more as an effort by the United States to contain and destabilize China and push for regime overthrow. I've actually traveled all over Xinjiang. I visited cotton fields. I visited factories. I haven't seen any instances or evidence of forced labor or genocide.
But Shaun, if that's the case, then why does the Chinese government not let foreign journalists in to see for themselves?
Yeah, but so I mean, like a foreigner can get on a plane and fly into Xinjiang tomorrow. They could fly in today and go anywhere. They don't need special permits.
And they wouldn't be followed by minders or anything like that?
With journalists, it's a little different.
I just want to bring this discussion back to the subject matter. And Brahma, my question is for you is, in the world that we're in today, does India, countries like India, do they still have to choose between East and West? Or is this, a choice that belongs in the past?
India is a world by itself. India is 1/6 of humanity. So India doesn't have to choose sides. India's economic growth relies not on exports. India is not an export-oriented economy. In fact, India imports far more than it exports. Its growth relies on domestic consumption. So India is a world by itself. But if I could return to your argument that the West is pursuing value-based foreign policy, and you mentioned Xinjiang sanctions, those sanctions against China, whether they are over the suppression of freedoms in Hong Kong or Xinjiang or in Tibet, these are all largely symbolic sanctions. They don't hit the principal decision makers. When was the last time you heard a Western leader speak about China's human rights record? Trump was in China recently. He never uttered a single word on the repression in Tibet or in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang or anywhere else. It further underpins a perception that strategic accommodation is increasingly taking precedence over principle and long-term security.
Chris, I wonder, given the interconnectedness of the world right now, I mean, are U.S. moves or Western moves like sanctions and things like that, is it possible to still make those moves without unintended consequences? And I just think of sanctions on Russia. I think of sanctions on Iran. The unintended consequence of that is that, well, China gets to buy all that oil and gas at a discount.
Look, I think, yeah, sanctioning big countries that have got an important role in global economy will always have negative pushback. And as you mentioned, Russia, a big supplier of energy, but also other materials, fertilizers, etc., all of which, have become more expensive, more difficult. And there has been, very significant negative consequences, particularly on Europe, because Europe used to be the biggest trade partner. And as sanctions against Russia has made it difficult to trade with Russia, it's the European economies that have suffered, and they're paying significantly more. Can I make one quick point?
Please.
Just go back. You were saying about the ideology versus transactional. And I would give you an example. The example is Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has adopted some very, very kind of repressive, tough legislation banning like LGBTQ2, suppressing basically all kind of anti-government forces, etc. There was a pushback from Europe. There was some complaints about these restrictive measures, but it quickly went away. The U.S., Washington, which previously has been very critical of these sort of measures around the world, said absolutely nothing. And now Europe really hasn't said anything of complaint either. And the reason is because the US and Europe want the critical minerals that are in Kazakhstan and have made no secret about it. And they've already made some investments. And Europe is funding the so-called Middle Corridor transit route. So here is a very clear example of where a government has adopted very, very repressive measures, the sort of measures that in the past would have absolutely led to instant condemnation, if not sanctions from Brussels and Washington, and now absolute silence. And I think we wait to see what happens with regard to the end of the Russia-Ukraine war. But the US has already, President Trump and some of his officials have already said that in the event of a peace deal, the US will start to ease sanctions against Russia immediately because they want US companies to have access to Russian resources. They want to trade with Russia. Europe, on the other hand, is saying that they're going to keep sanctions longer for ideological reasons, and this is going to be where where Europe is going to have to decide if the US and Korea and some other Asian countries are dropping sanctions and engaging with Russia. Can or will Europe decide to lose out, as it were, for ideological reasons, or will they just join and go in for practical reasons? So we already have some very clear examples of that shift from ideology to transactional already in place.
Shaun, China is currently ordering companies within its borders to ignore U.S. sanctions, specifically when it comes to oil refineries that buy oil from Iran. And I just wonder, are Western sanctions still effective when it comes to big countries like China, or do they only work in limited specific cases on maybe smaller countries that are more easily to isolate?
So because the United States, weaponized technology and weaponized the US dollar against China and Russia over the last 10 years, the Chinese have been worried about being sanctioned. And so what they did is they pushed for SIPs, which is the RMB trading system. They wanted to get away from the US dollars and the SWIFT system. And Marco Rubio himself said that in 5 years, the United States might not be able to sanction people anymore because nobody's going to use the greenback. So what China has done is they've reduced their US dollar holdings from 1.4 trillion to about $680 billion. They've pushed SIPs, so they're doing a lot of currency swaps with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other countries. And they're hoping that China is going to become a reserve currency for other nations, probably 5 to 10% of overall holdings. But right now, Scott, 40% of all cross-border trade done into China is done with the Chinese RMB. So China has been quite methodical at trying to de-risk from the United States, not just in trade and in technology with semiconductors, but also in being beholden to the US dollar. We saw during the Hong Kong terrorism and riots in 2019 that the United States slapped sanctions on the chief executive there, Carrie Lam. She was unable to be banked. She was basically unbanked, had to get paid in cash, wasn't able to use credit cards, wasn't easily able to travel around the world. Now, that was 7 years ago, and that scared all Chinese leaders. And they said, we can't be beholden to the greenback. we need to de-risk from the US dollar and push for SIPs.
Yeah, de-dollarization, certainly another topic of discussion. But Brahma, I just wonder if we are in fact in this world where values-based foreign policy is over and we're moving into a world of transactionalism, what happens to the institutions that underpin the sort of values-based, global rules-based order that the U.S. and the West have liked to talk about so much? For instance, the United Nations.
Today, the United Nations has been marginalized in international affairs. It has had no role to play in the Ukraine war, the Iran war, or any other conflict. The UN is the most truly international of all international institutions. Every nation state is a member of the UN. And all members of the UN have equal standing in this body. And yet, the UN has faced increasing marginalization. Some of the UN agencies are doing great work, but the UN itself, as the main body, has effectively been a bystander to international developments. And the reason is twofold. There are two reasons. One, that there have been no reforms in the UN to bring the structure of the UN up to date with the present power realities. And the second is the gridlock in the Security Council. Today, it's impossible for the Security Council to take any major decision because the major powers are at loggerheads. So the UN and other international institutions are today on the decline, and this is clear evidence that we are in a transition period to a new world order.
Chris, do you agree that this is the beginning of the end of the effectiveness or usefulness of the United Nations?
Absolutely, 100%. The UN is already walking dead. As far as I'm concerned, I think that the period of usefulness is long since past. I think there are some people, particularly in Europe, that have the view that this is only temporary. The UN is only temporary sideline because of Donald Trump. And when Trump leaves the office of the White House, then it'll go back to normal. And that simply is not the case. The US position regarding big global organizations like the UN and also, the World Health Organization and other organizations that the US has either already pulled out of or says it will pull out of, I think these organizations now serve very little purpose, but not the purpose that they previously had or the intended purpose. And with the emergence and strengthening of China in the world, then I think they will be completely marginalized, and I don't see any point in them continuing.
Gentlemen, it's a great discussion, and we certainly appreciate you all being here. That's Brahma Chellaney, Chris Weafer, and Shaun Rein. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, Jazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Scott McLean, and from the whole team here in Doha. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in a moment. Stay with us.